Hello. Do better than that. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
See, now I know some of my students are here. Okay, I many of you braved another important event, although this is the most important event that is happening on campus, and that is the town hall meeting with President Obama. And some people were scared of the campus. They thought there will be a lot of problems, and there still might be. But we are here, and we have our guests here. So what I want at the beginning, I'll give you a little bit of introduction to contextualize this particular panel, and then I will introduce to you the panelists so that I do not interrupt with the introductions of the panelists as we go along, and we have a smooth transition from one to another panelist. And the way is we'll have Professor Gillespie go first, and we'll have then Professor Uva de Aragon go second, and Professor Manya third, and Ms. Tanev fourth. Ms. Tanev is also our student in the Exile Studies program, so she will be sharing experiences with you after listening also to the three professors here. Everyone takes about 10 minutes. We will try to keep to the 10 minutes so that we can enjoy the questions and answers period later on, because I'm sure you will have a lot of questions, and people will be interested in interacting with these professors more after their formal presentations. The panel today is part of the program that we initiated in collaboration with the English department and the Center for the Humanities in an Urban Environment. And Dr. Gillespie, as you all know by now, he is the director of the center and is a wonderful collaborator and a partner, and more importantly, is a friend who inspires. So these are our sponsors. The Honors College, of course, was also very instrumental. But this program is part of the tradition that we are setting up here in conjunction with the initiative that we have of advancing Exile Studies. And when we established the Exile Studies a few years ago, we decided that it will not only be a certificate program, albeit it is the first in the country and probably in the world as well, but that this certificate program that is anchored in the English department in literary studies, although it is an interdisciplinary one, will be complemented by other events that will add to the experience the students or every student has to have on a campus. In other words, to be part of an intellectual milieu, to be exposed to different voices from different backgrounds. And so far, we had illustrious contributors to our enterprise come to the campus. Many of you were present at presentations by Sister Carol Rittner, by Gustavo Firmat Perez, Gustavo Perez Firmat, and Dr. Uva de Aragon was very instrumental in helping to bring him here. We had people from Israel, for example, the Russian-Israeli writer. We had people from Chile, Professor Agosin, and from Austin, Professor Zsuzsi Ostwás, and the president of Bard College, from where Professor Manya hails, Leon Botstein, and the Haitian-American writer, Edwidge Dantico, and the Cuban-American writer, Ana Menendez, and I can go on and on. And all this happened just in the last 3 or 4 years. So we have a lot of, and the individual lectures were alternating with the kinds of panels that we are having today. And the panel today is dedicated to actually teaching Exile literature. I know that Dr. Gillespie is teaching. Dr. Uva de Aragon not only is teaching, she was also a very often visitor in my classes, and I know that Professor Norman Mania not only writes about Exile, but also teaches it. And Ms. Stanner is a graduate of the Exile Studies program, and I'll tell you more about them. So let me introduce the participants in the order that they will be appearing here. Dr. Michael Gillespie joined the Department of English just 5 years ago, and he came from Marquette University, and to Marquette he came from University of Wisconsin, where he completed his PhD. Professor Gillespie is a noted scholar, and he has written over a dozen of books on different writers, such as Joyce and Oscar Wilde and William Kennedy, and many others. He also has written a couple more, or 3 monographs, I trust, right, and also a number of edited books. He is one of the top world scholars, of course, on Joyce here. He's also written a lot of articles, close to 70 articles and book chapters relating to English and Irish studies, and he's been on advisory board of half a dozen scholarly journals and has served as a reader for more than a dozen university presses. And he received fellowships from the American Philosophical Society, the National Endowment for Humanities, and he's been on the board of trustees of the International James Joyce Foundation and on the board of consultants for the Zurich James Joyce Foundation. His anthology of early Joyce criticism was published in the spring of 2011 as part of the University Press of Florida Joyce series. I also have to point out a very interesting marker in his scholarly biography. A few years ago, Dr. Gillespie was one of the lecturers in the Exile Studies program, and he talked about Joyce's Dubliners, talked about the exilic experiences reflected in the Dubliners, and out of that came not only the publication of his lecture, but also he decided to write a book on James Joyce, and that book will appear in a few months by Florida University Presses. So I'm very proud to have that kind of genesis of a scholarly work with roots in the program that we are doing here. So welcome, Professor Gillespie. And of course, Dr. Gillespie is teaching Exile literature also on the undergraduate and graduate levels. Now, let me introduce Professor Uva de Aragon, who I again consider a good friend of mine and have been affiliated with her in many different endeavors. She was the Associate Director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University until a few years ago, when she decided to dedicate her life fully to writing and lecturing, and that's what she's doing now. She is not only a publicist and a journalist and a memoirist, but she also is a novelist, and her novel, Memory of Silence, has just recently been translated in a bilingual edition. It's a thick book, but it also has the original in Spanish and also the English translation. And I have to tell you that I learned about this book when Professor Uva de Aragon came to talk to my class, especially about one story. It's called The Round Trip, and that story became the kernel, which flourished later on into a novel. Professor de Aragon has a lot of stuff appeared in textbooks and anthologies such as The Voice of the Turtle, Cuba, A Traveler's Literary Companion, and so on. She merited a number of literary awards from different universities, and she has also been the editor of Cuban Studies, which is one of the most prestigious magazines I know, although I'm not in the field, in Cuban Studies. And she's been editing that magazine for a number of years. She came to the United States as a teenager and grew into a major writer and scholar, and also a graduate of the University of Miami with a PhD in literature. So I can't wait to hear what Dr. Aragon has to say. And already now I want to announce that on March the 20th, there will be a panel that is dedicated to the publication of The Memory of Silence. It will be here on March the 20th, and I look forward to it since I'm also a participant in this panel. So it will be good to be part of this enterprise. Professor Norman Mania, we already know who he is. A number of you attended Professor Mania's lecture on Monday evening, and a number of you told me how much you enjoyed that lecture, including a number of my colleagues. Right, Mary Jane?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not divulging any secrets here, but Mary Jane wrote me an email, and she was absolutely taken by what you had to say. And Professor Mania is Francis Florney, Professor of European Studies and Culture and Writing Residence at Bard College. He's a native of Romania. And when he was just 5 years old, he, along with the entire Jewish population of Bukovina province in Romania, was deported to the concentration camp of Transnistria in the Ukraine. He was schooled later on, after he returned with his parents. He was schooled in communist Romania, and after earning an engineering degree, he worked in the field for more than a decade. And he commenced his literary career in 1974. He was a dissident in his thinking and in his writing. It was subversive in many ways. So as a dissident and opponent of totalitarianism, he was forced into exile in the late 80s. Mr. Mania has published over 20 books in different genres. The Lair, for example, a novel, The Hooligan's Return, a memoir, The Fifth Impossibility, a collection of essays on exile, which I highly recommend and always recommend it to my students. Professor Mania received important Romanian, American, and European cultural distinctions. He is the laureate of the Romanian National Prize for Literature and is the first Romanian writer to be granted the American MacArthur Fellowship, the Genius Fellowship as it is known, as well as the Italian International Nomino Prize, the French Medicis Étranger Prize, and many more, which if you want me to go on, I will certainly go on, but he can also tell you much more about this. He is a celebrated international author, and I am very, very pleased that you are here. And last but not the least, you have another participant, and that's Ms. Marian Stanev, who hails from Brazil, and sometimes we speak some Russian with her, and she's trying to improve it, and I'm trying to help her with that. So in a few years, she'll be very fluent in it, which is good. She comes to us from Brazil, but her English is perfect, as you will understand, and she graduated with a BA in English from our department, and then, being a woman of great taste, she decided to apply to our MA program, which she is now finishing. But I first met Ms. Stanev when she came to me to talk about joining the certificate program. And I tell you one thing, when I think of my best students, I very often think of Ms. Stanev. And I also had the privilege of being her professor on the graduate level. And more than that, I'm also on her committee of a thesis that Dr. Gillespie is directing. And I also have to add that I'm proud that one of the writers that she is exploring in her thesis is Vasily Grossman, Life and Fate. And another writer she explored with Dr. Gillespie, Virginia Woolf, make up the subject of her research. And her thesis, which she will be defending shortly, is called On Record, Soundscapes as Metaphors and Physical Manifestation of Memory in Early Holocaust Novels and Contemporary Criticism. I've read quite a bit of her thesis, and now I also know why the several universities, including Indiana and Michigan, extended an invitation to Ms. Stanev to start in their PhD programs with a full ride, and she is leaning or decided probably already to take Michigan. They sweetened the pie by yet another fellowship, and I want you all to add your congratulations to mine and wishing her good luck. And she already started her career as a young scholar by going to conferences, writing papers, and even doing internships in artistic venues, including the Art Center in downtown Miami. So we are in, as you see, for a wonderful afternoon, and I will ask Dr. Gillespie to start his presentation.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon to talk about teaching exilic literature, and it's a great honor to be on a panel with such distinguished panelists, individuals who know a great deal more about the content of exile than I do. So I'm going to take the role of a pedagogue and talk about the structure, about what it takes to put together a course on teaching exile, and I will leave it to others to talk more specifically about the subject of exile itself. The first thing I think that's important to do is to decide what is an exile writer. If any of us are asked that question, a lot of examples will pop into our minds immediately. Ovid was an exile writer. Excuse me. Dante was an exile writer. Emile Zola was an exile writer. Thomas Mann was an exile writer. But what does it mean? Because there are many writers who have, like Henry James, who have left their country and wrote for most of their adult lives outside of the land where they were born, that we wouldn't immediately consider to be an exile. An exile is, in my sense of the word, is someone who was compelled to leave his or her native home for political reasons, economic reasons, cultural, and increasingly in the 20th and 21st century for aesthetic reasons, for creative reasons. An exile writer, as I see it, may leave his or her native country, but never leaves the issues, the connection with that homeland. And in consequence, the writing that the exile author produces relates directly back to the world that he or she left. Sometimes, as in the case with James Joyce, focusing specifically on the experience of living in that country and the conflicts that in many ways forced the writer to leave. In other instances, Thomas Mann is a good example, not always writing specifically about Germany, but writing about the elements in Germany that both held his imagination and the social and cultural conditions that compelled him to leave. So it's the perspective of the exile writer is different from the traveling writer. It is in some ways bifurcated, writing from another country, but very much in the world that he or she has left. And often, and to me this was a striking element of exile literature, often writing about a world that is frozen in time. When you have left your country, as an exile, like Dante, you never stop thinking of it, but the world that you left has gone on, has evolved, has continued. In your writing, you are referencing a world that existed years and decades and even longer before the composition, and some might argue a world that never existed, because it is your representation of it is refined by your memory, by your recollections, by the attitudes that have evolved over the time you've been away. So an exile writer has a topic that seems very familiar to us, but is a tremendously subjective work. Exile literature is often, but not always, coincidental with an exilic author. And as I'll mention an example in just a moment of someone who doesn't seem to be in exile, but who writes from that perspective. But the work produced by an exile writer, by an exilic writing, generally focuses on sentiments of nostalgia and rancor, feelings of idealization for a world that was left behind. There's a very beautiful story by the Cuban-American writer Ana Menendez, entitled Her Mother's House, that describes a return to Cuba, a visit to Cuba by a young woman, a journalist, who had been told about Cuba and about the world that her mother had left by her mother, had never visited it, and comes to revisit that world and sees the stark contrast between the physical reality of the farm in Cuba where her mother was raised and the nostalgic recollections that her mother has presented. And it's done in a very restrained fashion, a very gentle, uncritical fashion, but in a way that produces in the story a sense of the deep pain that leads to nostalgia, the sentiment that covers the loss that the exile has felt. Not all exile writing reflects this kind of positive sentimentality. Often exilic writing has a tone of rancor, of resentment, of anger. When one is displaced, when one is compelled, when one is forced out of one's country, it is certainly not uncommon for that kind of reaction. Many authors, many critics will point to the works of James Joyce and look especially at the Dubliner stories, and see in there a tremendous sense of anger and criticism for Ireland. I saw on a personal level, I saw a flash of that when my grandfather, who was born in the west of Ireland, County Mayo, in a place called Achill Island, which is on the very tip of the west. He came to this country as a 19-year-old and spent his entire life in adult life, working in America. And I remembered when he was in the hospital dying, and he knew it, we knew it. He had come to the point where he was going to die. I would go and visit him, and one day I was talking with him, and I asked him, because my grandmother had always spoken about going back to Ireland. She too was from Achill Island. She spoke of it all the time. She never went back, but she spoke of it all the time. And I said to him, why did you never talk about returning to Ireland? And he looked at me and he said, Michael, they couldn't feed me when I was there. And I'm goddamned if I'm going to go back and feed them now. He was not a man who expressed his sentiment very often. And he had never before said anything particularly negative about Ireland, but in a moment, I got a sense. He was a younger son on the farm. He didn't have a choice. He had to leave. And it was a moment of epiphany for me to see the kind of scar that stays after 60 years that still is fresh. For me, studying exilic writing opened up a sense of work, of a particular work, even a work that I had been familiar with, that made it fresh, that made it engaging in ways I was unaware of. Often, reading an exilic writer, there is the ability to clarify the link between the author and the work under consideration. Nabokov, especially his novel Penin, is a wonderful example of that. Taking up the exilic perspective allows you to, it gives a name to attitudes and points of view in narratives that have often, for me, were often very difficult to pin down. And I see that in the works of Oscar Wilde or James Baldwin. Reading from an exilic perspective opens areas of the narrative that were previously unnoted. As Professor Milbauer mentioned, I'd worked for a great many years on James Joyce, and I knew he left Ireland when he was 22 and never really returned for more than a short visit. But I never really thought of him as an exile, and when I did, a great many elements of his fiction became much clearer to me, much fuller, much richer. And finally, exile expands the way that we can see even writers who expanded my insight, even into writers who seem very much grounded in the place they were born and seem very much a part of it. Philip Roth is the example that I always think of, and in a narrative like Everyman, he captures the kind of alienation, the kind of isolation, the kind of rancor that I at least see in other exile writers, and thinking of him as having that exilic perspective, perhaps not being an exile himself, but feeling that kind of isolation, that kind of alienation, gave me insights into his narrative that I don't think I otherwise would have had. Like any approach, exile does not exhaust the possibilities for interpretation. And it's not a prescriptive way of reading. But for me, approaching literature from an exilic perspective has greatly enriched my understanding of what I have read, and that's why it's such a pleasure to be here with these exiled writers. Thank you very much.
Well, I am also very happy to be here with my former and forever colleagues and such a distinguished author. And I retired almost 4 years ago, so it really feels good to be back at FIU. I was going to start by making a confession, which I have never taught exilic literature. I am an exile writer, but I've participated in conferences and gone to classes to discuss my own work. And what happened is that as I was preparing for this, I started thinking how I would prepare a course, and many of the things he said, even some of the words. So I'm going to skip that part because I would be repeating a lot of the things that Professor Galepsi said. But I would just add two things because my heading said writing or teaching exile writer in a place like Miami where there's so many Cuban exiles. And the two things that I would add in a case like Miami would be the difference between an immigrant and an exile. And exactly now, as you know, the president is talking about immigration. This is an important national theme. And as a Cuban, even now, people say that the Cubans that come now are not really exiles, but immigrants because they go back often and because different circumstances, economic circumstances. I think that the most important difference between an immigrant and an exile is that an immigrant looks forward, and an immigrant looks back. An immigrant wants their children to learn the language of their new country, wants to be assimilated. Exiles wants their children to learn their mother tongue, to be proud of their identity. And if there are any children of exiles here, they probably know that, and grandmothers, and the cooking, they don't want to be Cuban or not to be Russians. They want to instill that. And mainly, immigrants dream and exiles remember. And that's a very important difference. They don't want to forget their forbidden land. I think another thing I would stress is that pain of separation, which, as Professor Galaxy said, is forced from your homeland, that this feeling of uprootedness, this dichotomy between your love for your country and your resentment against the regime or the tyrant that forced you to leave, and has stripped you of your rights, sometimes even of your citizenships, cannot be compensated. Even if you enjoy all the freedoms that a country like the United States gives you, even if because there's such mobility in this country, you achieve success or you accumulate richness, even if as a writer you become famous and published, there's an emptiness. There's this yearning that cannot be compensated by anything. When I talked about things like being stripped of your rights and your citizenship, I was fortunate many years ago, I don't know, 40 years ago maybe. I didn't look up the date. I'm sure if I did, I would find it. I had the privilege of listening to one of your compatriots, the musician and director Rostropovich, in Washington. That day, the Soviet Union had stripped him of his citizenship, and he directed the orchestra just with Russian music. And the people it was just magic when he finished. And they would applaud, and we would applaud standing up. And he would direct the applause to the music, to the sheet music, because he was applauding his nation, his country, his people above the regime that had just stripped him of his citizenship. So that dualship between the angerness that you have and the love you have for your country is very much at the core of what an exile is. But it's very hard for even your children or your grandchildren to understand. I left Cuba when I was 15, 2 days after I became 15. I come from a family of writers. And I'm going to talk about myself because I think that might give you an insight into what an exile writer is. And I didn't go back for 40 years. And when I went, for example, to my grandmother's house, that the family who worked there are there, everything was the same. One of the things that impressed me most was the tiles, because the tile floors in Cuba have patterns. Because the universe of a child is very close to the floor as you play. Now, it's different, you have video games and stuff, but when I was a child, you would play dolls, and you would play with little soldiers, and you would play jackies, and you would play sitting on the floor. And so, and the dining room with the two chairs, the chair where my grandmother used to sit, and I never saw again my grandmother, it's right there in the same place. The ashtrays, the knickknacks of the home, they're there. The pictures, the furniture, they haven't moved anything. Everybody who lived in that house has passed away and had passed away by the time I left. And their things were there. And I tried to explain to I have 4 grandsons, aged 22 to 18. I tried to explain, suppose you would have to leave this country. You wouldn't come back in 40 years. And you would come to this house, and you would never see me again. And I have passed away, and your aunt has passed away, and your mother has passed away, and my things are here, my books are here. the things you've grown up with are here. And you forgot, because 40 years gone back. But when you come back, they come so back and hits you. There's no way they can understand. I don't think they can. When I left Cuba, middle class, my father a doctor, university professor, and on my mother's side writers, and I knew many writers. And I started writing when I was 9, and I was even published in the newspapers and the school newspaper. The real newspaper had one of the contests for young people. And all of a sudden we went to Washington, D.C. And I found myself surrounded by English and snow. And we go to the movies, and we know anybody, totally stranger. I had brought up in the city, but we were known and had friends and everything else. And exile is very lonely. For a few years, I wrote in English. I had gone to an American school, and I knew English going finishing my high school. I wanted people I worked with, people to understand what I was writing. And then I went back to Spanish, and I'm very glad I did, because I felt that there was a very intimate connection into feeling as a Cuban and writing in Spanish. And Gustavo Perez-Firman and I has had a 40-year discussion on that matter. Do you consider literature written by a Cuban in English as Cuban literature? He says yes, and I said, I don't know. Time will tell. I decided that I was going to write in Spanish because I wanted to write for Cubans. I wanted to be a Cuban writer. I wanted that one day, when this history of Cuban literature was written and taught, that my name would be included. And something that I should have known earlier in life gave me a lot of hope. I had read Jose Marti since I was a child. There's a famous poem by him called Los Zapaticos de Rosa, about a girl in the sand and place, and it's a poor girl and doesn't have any shoes, and she gives her pink shoes. And I would cry, and I knew it by heart. And I was quite an adult when I realized that Marti was not talking about the sands and the ocean of Cuba. This, what he was describing, was in Long Island. And generations of Cuban children had read, memorized, imagined that poem. And for me, I was going to see Pilar right there when I went to the beach in my childhood. I said, well, if Marti can get away with it, maybe I can too. Maybe what I write will go back, and when they read me, they won't know. And it happened sooner than I thought, because a Cuban author asked me about, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, for a short story to be included in an anthology in Cuba. And my translator, Jeff Barnett, went to Cuba and picked up that anthology and read my story, and the anthology did not say where the writers lived, and he thought I was a Cuban writer that lived in Cuba. And it wasn't until years later that he found another anthology and found another story that I realized that I was not a writer living in Cuba. So I'm very happy of my decision to write in Spanish. And this novel, and there are some cards there, this, as I said, is bilingual, has a long story. I wrote it in a sabbatical while I was here in 1999. It came out in 2002. The story of two sisters, one who stays in Cuba and one who comes to exile very young at 18. I had to make her a little older than I was when I left, because she leaves married, and I left at 15, and that seemed quite a little bit too young. But it was important for me to put myself in the place of a Cuban woman living in Cuba all those years I wasn't there, and to try to learn how it would have been my life. I think everybody who lives something of themselves. And while I was writing, I went to Cuba for the first time. And then I realized something else. I had always thought about us, exiles without Cuba. I hadn't thought about Cuba without us. And everybody who left an emptiness. I had never realized the emptiness, the nostalgia of the people who stayed behind. cousins I left that never went back by the block of our grandmother. And finally, when I insisted, but how come I've been dreaming of seeing you, you don't go by? And finally, the third time I asked, she said, don't you understand that house is full of the ghosts of all of you who left? And she told me in tears how it was to say goodbye, or people who didn't say goodbye and disappear, how seeing the house since I was living with other people living in there, how, putting the phone book, the phone, people who weren't there anymore, and how we had one big terrible goodbye, but we had new images that we added to that, but they stayed with those same images. So I realized that the pain is two ways. So it became the first Cuban to publish an ebook in 2010 in Spanish. Then last year it was adapted to the theater, and it came out of all places in Venezuela, and then here in Miami, and then in Santiago de Chile. And then this bilingual edition came out last November, and we launched it at the Miami Book Fair in November. And just last week, I presented it at the Book Fair in Havana. And that brings me a whole new question, was when you return home, and when you present a book at the Book Fair, and you write in Cuban magazines, and I have 2 books to be published in Cuba, am I still an exile writer? And the answer, well, of course, my work is a work as an exile writer. The pain, the nostalgia, the mixed feelings are there in my work, no matter. And I feel I still am an exile writer. I hope that someday I won't feel this way, but I still feel that way. I feel like I open little spaces and I can get there and I can have people recognize my name in small groups, but the mainstream of the culture, I'm still not part of that. And until that occurs, I will always be an exile writer. And the pain of the years of exile will remain with me and will be in my work. And I don't want to be over my 10 minutes, and so maybe you'll have questions later. Thank you very much.
I hope, of course, that this panel makes you feel at home.
Of course it does.
Yeah, as it was said here, I'm coming from Romania and now from Bard College, a small fancy college upstate New York, which has 1,500 students, almost inexistent compared with this university, but students from 30 countries, so it's very cosmopolitan and very worldly and global. Exile is a very acute, I would say, and hot issue in our time because of migration and a lot of other things. It can be seen in very concrete ways. It can be seen in a much more general philosophical way by the people who said that we are in exile in the moment we are taken out from the womb of our mothers. And the very end is the end of the life itself, which is the final exile, which in the book which you mentioned by Philip Roth is so strong and vivid in the Everyman, where the funeral is ending with a very tough and icy kind of feeling of solitude. I will not enter in all this. I prefer books which combine both. And my class, I will try to be more factual about my class at Bard. I teach at Bard for more than 10 years already a class which is called Exile and Estrangement in Modern Fiction. And the writers which I included there with their work are the following. We may want to discuss about them and to debate. For now, I would like only to put it straight. Starting with Nabokov's Spin, which you mentioned, which is a wonderful book, small novel. it's a bit buffoonish, the main character, but sad and very appealing, of Russian intellectuals who still consider that Shakespeare Hamlet is better in Russian than in English. Then I go to Kundera, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, where you have people going into exile because of political condition and coming back to the country, into another exile, into the internal exile. And this combination puts together a lot of tension and feelings and questions. Then another book which I have is the book by Isaac Bashevis Singer, Enemies, A Love Story, which deals with Holocaust survivors who live in the States, feel totally lost, and can never, in fact, overcome their story, their horror story. It's interesting also when we speak about language that he wrote in a dying language, in Yiddish, which was his language as a writer. He came from Poland, but he wrote in Yiddish. And the book expressed in a way, in a very contemporary way, a destiny of a people who were for a long time, if not ever, in exile, the Jewish people. It's a very interesting, very tough, and extremely appealing novel. Another book which I have in my curriculum is a book by Pamuk, the Turkish Nobel laureate, which is called Snow, and deals with a Turkish poet who left Turkey also because of political reasons and lives in Germany for a long time and comes back to Turkey again. And he is assigned by a friend of his who is a journalist to go to a little place, a little city, where in the last time there happened a lot of suicides by young girls because of this intrusion of the Islamic fanaticism. And it's a quite interesting, tense story about what it means to be in exile in your own country, to go away, to feel totally lost in a very civilized, modern, prosperous country as Germany, to come back and feel even more exiled in your own country, and to live again abroad and there to commit suicide. This circle, which closes a tragedy, very modern, very contemporary one, is telling us a lot about the issues of our contemporaneity in Muslim countries, but not only there. Then I have two books by two writers which were my guests in my class at Bard. I have another class which is called Contemporary Writers, where I have guests who come to meet and confront the class and me about their own writing. They are both Muslim writers. One is Tahar Ben Jalloud, a Moroccan writer of French language. His book is Leaving Tangier, and it deals with a couple who is looking to the other side of the sea, it's Morocco, where they think it's much better and it's a much happier and free life. They go there, they are very unhappy, they come back, it's more or less the same story. And Nuruddin Farah, which is a Somali writer, with his novel Maps, that deals with the conflict between Somalia and one of his neighbors, and the infiltration of terrorists into Somalia, all the trouble which this kind of aggressive invasion brings. Then I have some books which are a combination, speaking about the topic. In fact, all of these books are a combination of estrangement and exile. They are topics which are very close to each other, as you well know. So I teach Thomas Mann Death in Venice. Probably you read this book. It's a novella. And it deals with a writer, a mature writer, who has a blog and feels the need to leave his place, to go to another one and to refresh and regenerate himself. So he goes finally to Venice, and there he is very tormented by his past, but also by what is happening there with him. He falls in love with a young, beautiful boy. It's not anything sexual, but it's extremely erotical and intense, and goes to this extreme experience which is shaken him up, and in that time huge infection of cholera comes from the Orient and starts to kill a lot of people there. So Death in Venice is about this collective death, which comes from I don't know where, but we can take it metaphorical, that it comes from some bleak places outside, and his own death in the very end. As an old man, an old writer, quite famous, who everything which he realized in his writing was, as he says, despite his vulnerability, despite his considered lack of talent, despite of his very troubled mind and soul. He realized important big work, as it was the case with Thomas Mann himself. And in the end, he dies in this condition. I have now, an essential book, I would say, about estrangement and exile, which is Albert Camus' The Stranger, which deals with his hero, the protagonist, Merceau, very lonely man, who feels exiled from the world and from himself. His main feature, I would say, is indifference. So he goes on as a very lonely and detached man, until, totally by chance, he kills an Arab man on the seashore there, and has to face a trial which puts him essential questions about his life, about his dealing with this almost icy detachment from the world. The novel starts with the death of the mother and the telegram that he receives about this death. Maman is dead, and the quite calm and very detached behavior, his behavior about the news and even at the funeral. I go on with Kafka's book, The Sons. Again, it is and it is not about real exile, but many writers and many people are exiled, as you know, in their own room, in their own country, in their own hospital room, and so on. Not necessarily, absolutely necessary to go into another place to be exiled. Of course, this emphasizes and accentuates the feeling of being nowhere. The Sons, this book has three texts by Kafka. Of course, the Metamorphosis, which is the metaphor of estrangement and exile, the Verdict, and the fragment from Kafka's novel America. And I finish the class usually with a fairy tale, a German romantic fairy tale by a poet, an exiled poet, French poet who lived in Germany, Adalbert von Chamisso, who became a great, great botanist. And there are in California even some flowers that have his name, who wrote this fairy tale, which is called The Man Who Sold His Shadow. You may want to read it. You will see that it's not necessarily for children. It has a great metaphor in itself about exile and loneliness, but also about our time. Because for the first time, the devil, which appears in Faust and in other romantic stories, is not more a devil, but a dealer. He speaks in the name of the devil, but he is only a dealer, typical for our time, late capitalism, where all the time you buy and sell something. And he is ready, he is proposing to this exile, to this wanderer, to buy his shadow. And for that he gives him not immortality, as it happens usually, nor use forever, but gives him a bag of money that are recycling all the time. What you spend comes back in the bag. So nothing can be more happier than this. As the money in our time, and not only in our time, I would say, you have everything. You are the emperor of yourself. You are the god of yourself. What happens is that people around started to be suspicious about the man who doesn't have a shadow, as it happens with a lot of people in exile, because he is a stranger. He's not exactly as the people in that place. So he's different. What is with this guy? It's something which is not okay. So he loses some girlfriends and a lot of things go on. He tries to go out only during the night in order not to be shown without a shadow and all this stuff. In the very end, he gives up on humankind, becomes a researcher of nature in a cave. To make the connection to the author himself, I would add that the poet Chamisso was of French origin and who had to leave France because of the revolution, because he came from a very noble aristocratic family and they lost everything. He lived in Germany, he even fought in the war against France in the German army. He became a great, great botanist. And if you have the chance, and I would recommend, to see the Botanic Garden in Berlin, which is absolutely amazing, you will see also the photo of this founder, Adalbert von Chamisso. This von is already German. It's noble, but it's German. It's not Adalbert de Chamisso, as it is in French. So you have destinies of exile here everywhere. I forgot one book, which I will add now. Another book which is on my list is Lydia Naipaul's book, The Enigma of Arrival. It's an interesting book from the point of view of an exile who knows almost everything about the country where he's coming without being there. So he is a young man from Trinidad who read British literature as a crazy reader, and knows everything about London before he arrives there. This helps and didn't help. So he still has this feeling of estrangement, of exile. It's a very interesting story also because what appears here very different and very special is what he learns about another nature, about another landscape. Because this British landscape, as you may imagine, is very different from Trinidad. So suddenly he has in front of him another proposal, another suggestion, which also in a way enhances his estrangement. I stop here. Whatever you would like to speak or to ask, I will.
Exile literature in the present. I also think that the autobiographical approach reinforces the fact that choosing to study the literature of exile is a narrative that is unique for each student of the subject. Let me start with the brutal truth. I ended up in my first literature classroom because a guidance counselor had decided that that's where she was going to send all the slackers that wandered into her office asking for help. In hindsight, I think her train of thought was something like, where do I send the people who can't handle science and math? Let's see, a place with no tests, few requirements, and maybe where homework is something like reading stories. The English department. The actual brutal part of the brutal truth in that is that I believed her. During my first year as an English major, I thought I was sitting through lectures on Renaissance literature and Mark Twain and something called post-colonial something because I couldn't hack doing something more useful. I hated it. My first impression of literature was that it was a waste of time. I was about to drop out of college, or worse, but I decided to give it one more try. I enrolled for another semester of literature courses. That semester, two things happened that changed it all. The first thing that happened is I learned that the author was dead and that A does not equal B. The freedom in those statements was immeasurable. Those things meant that the absolute truths of science were gone. In other words, the values that rendered me a stupid slacker were gone. I felt like a newborn. Then another thing happened. I was sitting in a poetry class thinking all the time in my head, oh my God, the author is dead and there's no truth. When a very well-dressed gentleman with a sleek haircut and a Russian accent walked into the classroom. He started talking about a certificate program on exile literature. I could almost talk exclusively about that moment for my entire presentation today. But I will have to summarize it for brevity, since I still have to tell you about how I put literature to the test and how I chose it as a career. That day, I thought, wow, the past. It exists and it matters. Then, that's when I realized that literature was about more than being mesmerized by smart, long-dead authors. I realized that it could be about my past, too. Questions about my own family started coming into focus. How did I end up being a white South American again? Oh yeah, Stalin and Mussolini. Wait, wasn't one of my great-grandparents native Brazilian? Oh yeah, post-abolition slave trade. And how did I end up in the US again? Oh yeah, white immigrants get all the cake in South America, then we come to the US to have even more cake. Then, understanding my own narrative, I started having the internal apparatus to be receptive of the stories about other people's families. Jewish ancestries, African American, South Asian. Exile literature taught me how to listen. The years that followed were a mad race to catch up with my own records so I could get to graduate school and continue studying exile literature. I made it, and I had all of the symptoms of an excited novice. Full trust in my mission, exuberant energy, and a million things to say about literature, and equally as many answers to people who thought literature was a waste of time. At the start of my MA, I was told I'd have to write a thesis. The prospect was delightful at first. A short book's worth of my thoughts on literature, sign me up. Then, very quickly, things got bleak. The realization was that I was spending most of my most productive years, learning how to write a short book's worth of my thoughts on literature for a handful of people around me to read. It was like the enormity of the issues that brought me to literature, exile, literary theory, and the past, were suddenly contrasted to the smallness of the everyday life tasks of being a student of literature. You choose a topic, you write something, you meet a deadline, you graduate, and then the same thing when you're a professional. You choose a topic, you write about it, you try to get it published, you try to make a living. I couldn't stop thinking, what do those people in unmarked graves or mass graves care about the books I like and what I think about them? It wasn't as though I was back to square one with literature, but I realized I needed to put it to the test again. I decided that if I was going to choose exile literature as something that I'm going to do for the rest of my life, I had to spend my MA writing about the toughest, most horrible, most difficult, and most unsettling events of the 20th century. I thought, if literature is still standing after that, I'll go with it. I am now just emerging from that journey, and what I have to report are mixed results. On the one hand, I'm about to get a second serving of literature, and on the other hand, my second plate is coming with a different topic. This fall, I'll start a comparative literature PhD program in the University of Michigan. So literature has passed the test, but only when linked with a dangerous traveling companion, social studies. The project that took me to Michigan is a literary project, but it's also a project about material things, like physical archives and fieldwork. To illustrate the shape of exile literature in my mind right now, at this point in my journey, I'll tell you about a phone call I got from the director of the graduate program in Conflict at the University of Michigan. First question he asked me was, who else has accepted you already? I was taken aback. This man was really impressed with what I had to say in my application. He went on, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, quote, first of all, you're everything. He meant my cultural background. Then he said, and the comparative project you want to do, the literatures, the methodology, fascinating. Now let me fill you in. I'll read you my statement of purpose. Not my statement, short answer, of course. My ambition as a scholar is to use my transcultural background to find a unique perspective of comparative literature for the new global South. Before I introduce my PhD project, I'd like to offer a brief explanation of the context from which my interests emerge. I was born in Brazil as a genealogical intersection of two families, diasporic Russophone Bessarabians and Italian native Brazilians. The thoroughly diverse social-linguistic atmosphere in which I grew up made it natural for me to seek the intersection of seemingly irreconcilable poles in academia. In my PhD project, I want to study literary soundscapes and musical archiving in diasporic literatures of the Global South. Specifically, I want to look at diasporic African and Jewish literatures in Lusophone and Anglophone, to some extent Russophone, South and North America. So the way I see it, that person and that project has just received $250,000 worth of stipend, tuition waivers, and fellowship from taxpayers in Michigan. She got there because of exile literature. My acceptance into the program and my personal acceptance of exile literature as my career seemed to me like incredibly good news for the field, not because I'm too self-loving, but because of the money that's going into this. Major universities are putting down the money for Exilic projects. Now that you've heard my journey through exile literature, I'd like to pose the question of how the issues I faced play out for other exile students. It is important to remember that the answers I found are uniquely my own. Other students might find diametrically opposed answers, manners of approaching the choice of literature as a career. While I cannot know what exactly each student goes through as they make the choice to study exile literature, I know that each story is utterly personal, and the stakes are never small. For teachers of exile literature, it is important to remember that as soon as you take this subject into the life of a young college student, you are going to wreak havoc. A wonderful kind of havoc, but havoc nonetheless. Teaching and learning exile literature is a painful task. I would like to end by sharing the dedication of my master's thesis with you, because I think it sums up my feelings on exile literature right now. This is the dedication. I dedicate this thesis to persons whose memories can only be known if our will to reach the faults of archived history surpasses the faults in our own aptitudes. I hope my writing can offer a fitting revenge for the offense of unmarked graves, scattered ashes, and lousy progenies. Thank you.
Listening to these esteemed professors and would-be professors is like taking another course within 1 hour. In a way, so much ground was covered here, dealing with nostalgia, what Kundera in the novel of Ignorance defined the suffering, the pain of absence, dealing with rancor, dealing with intergenerational tensions, dealing with a lot of things that I associated with trauma sometimes, but also with joy. because the burdens and joys go hand in hand, I think. Um, Another thing that came up and that is very important in exile literature is the choice of the medium of artistic expression. You heard Professor Aragon talking about why she writes in Spanish. We heard Professor Mania talk the other night and also implying today why he is not interested in a rented language, or when you give up a language for a passport, what happens at that time. Isaac Bashevis Singer has also captured in a very succinct way when he was asked, why do you write in Yiddish, which is basically after the Holocaust is a dead language in a way. And he simply put it, when the time of resurrection will come and those 6 million souls will come back, what do you think they will want to do? They will want to read a book, and that book will be mine. And they understand Yiddish, so I have to do it that way. But one thing also becomes clear from all these discussions, as again Singer put it in Enemies a Love Story and in other works as well, that you cannot get rid from a sense of exile. You cannot discard the past. As he put it, we run away from Mount Sinai, and Mount Sinai runs after us. So in many ways, we are talking about tensions here between the past and the present, and those kinds of tensions dealing with dispossession, dislocation, liminality, and many other things that exile literature and exile studies is exploring are echoed in these presentations. And I'm sure that you want to explore them further. Our time designated on our brochure or the flyer was from 3 to 5 o'clock. I will not deprive you of the pleasure of listening to our esteemed guests. If you have questions, I'm sure they will entertain these questions. So please don't be bashful. Identify yourselves and ask what you want to ask. Yes.
Hi.
Professor.
Good afternoon. My name is Nicola Gavioli. I have a question for Professor Gillespie and Professor Mania. Professor Gillespie mentioned a novel by Philip Roth, Everyman, and which is also a novel about how a person becomes another through diseases, through aging, through depression. And I know that one of the topics as well of Professor Mania's writing is also melancholy. So I would like to know if you have something to say about this particular meaning of exile. So becoming exiled through disease, through melancholy, to become another. If this is something that you thought about or you wrote about, and if you have something to say about that.
For me, Everyman is a quintessential postmodern narrative. It begins with a funeral and it ends with a funeral. It underscores the isolation that comes to an individual who lives in the material world with nothing else to define his identity. This is a man who has, and the narrative covers the life of the central character from the time that he's a young boy living in New Jersey with a father who's a jeweler, through his experiences as an artistic director in a New York advertising agency, the marriages that he's had, the failed marriages that he's had, and finally his isolation and death. And what struck me about this character is an absence of any sense of right and wrong, of any sense of a metaphysical surrounding. He inhabits the world in which he exists in the way any other animal does. I see him as an exile because throughout Roth's narrative, as I read it, there are moments of nostalgia, moments of a desire for a connection with his daughter, with contemporaries in this retirement community that he's living in with friends. And he is capable of great tenderness. There's one section where he calls 3 different people who he had known while he was working in advertising, and 2 of them and the widow of a third. And he expresses concern about their health, but he is unable to sustain any kind of connection, even with the daughter who he claims to love and who loves him very dearly. He's a person in isolation, a person who has a projected world, a nostalgic world that he reaches for, but one that he simultaneously denies, that cannot exist for him. And so this is how I come to see him as an exile, and the paradigmatic postmodern figure, the individual who lives in the non-metaphysical world, who lives in a world without values, not a world without rules, because society needs some sort of construction so that we don't all go through the traffic light, the traffic intersection at the same time, unless we live in Miami. But there is no extended value to anything that he does, and that it's a terrifying representation, but a very powerful and beautiful one for me.
Yeah. Before we go to another question, just like to add something to what Dr. Gillespie said, and we talked about this novel many times, and that is exile is not only taught as a phenomenon of uprootedness, violent uprootedness, but also exile is used as a metaphor. And in this case, you have mortality and old age explored as an exilic kind of a state. And the second thing is that this novel was, at least it seems to me, was a response to what happened in America just a short time ago, and that is 9/11, where, as Ross puts it, many felt the sense of exile as a result of that horrific event. So there are a lot of opportunities for this book to be explored on many levels, as Dr. Gillespie is pointing out.
Yeah, I would add only very few things. I don't think that literature itself can be without melancholy, without a deep sense of loneliness and sometimes even nothingness. And what it does, it makes from this a very big, great topic of the struggle of the human beings against this nothingness. I would add something which is rather indiscreet. I was with Philip Roth at the event who inspired this story. It was the funeral of Saul Bellow. We were there. It was a kind of very Jewish ceremony. And then, after people left, Philip was even more taken. I was also a close friend of Bellow, but I was a late friend because I came late here. Speaking about exile, also I called exile the privileged trauma, a privileged trauma. For people who come young into exile, they have, in my opinion, a big chance to have also the privilege of exile, to open up to the unknown, to go beyond their little kind of universe, to regenerate and reevaluate their own biography and their own belief. For people who come late, and it was my case, they usually go mainly to the trauma. I was lucky to see also the privileges of exile. But this is speaking about Saul Bellow. Of course, Philip Roth was a close friend of his, and for a long, long time, I made a book with Bellow, a long dialogue, because his last dialogue And when he was still very lucid and humorous and with a great sense of humor, after that he faded and he was not more himself. He went into this very final exile, which we speak about death, about amnesia, about everything which is coming for unfortunately for all of us at a certain point. So exile, as I said, can be seen in a very factual, concrete way, because there are stories with this great extreme adventure. It can be seen also in a great context, in the context of human destiny. And I think the writing which combines both are probably the best.
Thank you.
I have
What's your name?
Juan. My name is Juan.
Don Juan?
No.
Don't get me.
I have a question for the five of you. Through the process of exile, there's one key point that all of you discussed, and yesterday you mainly stressed on, and is the clash of social identity. Do you feel Irish, Professor?
It depends on how you define Irish. And I'm not being, I don't mean to be coy. I feel a keen sense of Irish antecedents. My grandparents were all born in Ireland. And I feel that understanding Ireland helps me understand them. Understanding them helps me understand the way I see the world. So that's part of me.
Absolutely.
To what degree I'm Irish, to what degree I'm American, to what degree I'm and this is to what degree I'm any of those categories is always in a state of flux. But I think that it is because all of us are continually defining and redefining our identities. And this is where exile has really enlightened me. I've come to see the difficulty of knowing who we are and the complexity of the process. It comes out of my struggles to learn Spanish, which helped me understand how difficult it is to speak any language and how incalculably difficult it is to speak another language, a second language. So exile has given me a perspective on the formation of identity that I did not have before.
And that could be tied to the privilege portion that you were mentioning earlier. And my question was asking each and every one of you if you feel Cuban, you feel Russian, you feel Romanian, you feel Brazilian. Because there is a constant clash of social construction in the identity, as you were mentioning, of where do we come from? How do we define ourselves? Where are we going? Are the different types of
It's a question that go back and forth, no?
yeah, exactly. And then as you all having different backgrounds, focusing yourself in exile writing, which bases itself in different identities and social construct by understanding the different places that you have been in your lifetime. How would you define that clash of social identity and social construct?
I like to tell you that I feel Cuban. It's a difference. I was born in Cuba. I lived there until I was 15. I didn't go back for 40 years. Perry-Filman has this theory about life in the hyphen. I have never felt in the hyphen. I've been Cuban. And it was a great consolation to me when I understood the difference between citizenship and nationality. I'm a U.S. citizen, and I take great pride in it, and of being a good citizen of the United States. But I'm a Cuban at heart, in the way I talk, in the way I use my hands, in the way I write, in the way I eat, in the way I long for that nation. And when I'm there, and I was just came back, last Sunday, And in spite of the broken streets, in spite of the poverty, in spite of everything, I'm home. And it is something difficult because even people from my generation insist that I'm a Cuban American. And no, I'm Cuban. And also because maybe there are people in Cuba don't accept me as Cuban. But I don't care. That's what I am and who I am. And at my age, you defy everybody else defining you. You define yourself and you don't care whoever else thinks. And you know that books have a way of finding themselves into people, and if you write as a Cuban, you feel as a Cuban, someday somebody will say, actually, this was a Cuban writer.
Maybe you can speak to what happens when the hyphens start piling on, you know?
That's a good one.
Right? When you're a second generation this, a third generation that, a first generation something else that you're causing in your own life. And I think what's happening in my case is, not that it stops mattering what I am, but trying to define it in specific terms, it is meaningless. Because the moment I try to say, no, I know exactly what I am. My family, look at my last name, look at the way I look, I'm this thing, or look at my accent, listen to my accent, I'm from this place. It starts feeling, first of all, disrespectful to all the other hyphens. It starts to feel fake because I don't think in one language, I think in 4 or 5, whatever happens at the moment. I like to always say this, my dreams have no sound at all. Because I guess my brain is like, we're taking a break from thinking of all those languages and sounds, so we're just going to press mute and just look at pretty images. So all sorts of things happen, and as I said, well, it could just be that I'm strange, but I don't care. It's probably my diagnosis. But let me say, not caring in the sense of not thinking it's a very important question, but it's a question that is ever more comfortably open for me, and I think for a lot of people in our generation who are second, third generation, some things and several stuff.
So I will say this. The American writer Gertrude Stein, who lived in Paris for almost her entire life, made this difference between identity and entity. She said identity is what connects us to other people. You are a man, you have glasses, and you probably have a certain accent. I don't know from where. You are connected to all these categories. To people who are male, to people who wear glasses because they have to look with glasses, and so on. You like baseball, you like girls, whatever. It connects you to a certain group of people, also to religion, if it is the religious connection. And entity is what remains when we are alone in a room. Now, when we are alone in a room, all these things don't disappear. You are still a guy with glasses, probably even in your room, and you are still a male, and you are still connected to different categories of people. But what she wanted to emphasize is that it is something at the core of our individuality, which goes beyond all these components. And I and you and people who are not male and not with glasses, we can in a way connect to our core of human beings, to our entity. So I think we have to take into account when we speak about these two things. I am a Romanian Jew who is an American citizen, and I defined America, which I very much admire, that's the best hotel. I think it is the best hotel because you are comfortable here, because the bills are correct, almost everything is functioning, and you are not asked to be in a certain way. You are whatever. You have to respect the Constitution, you have to respect the laws of the country. All the other questions are your problem. So, how would you define me? As a tenant in a hotel who was and still is partially a Romanian Jew. Even this story with Romanian Jew or whatever other Jew is complicated because it's dual. I was born there, I grew up there, I was in love there, I saw there for the first time the sea, which I never forget, and all this stuff. I suffered there. And I was very angry that I was thrown away the second time, first as a child, then as a mature man. The connection is there, but it's a kind of love-hate. When I go back, I says, and I said it in my book, that I am a tourist of my posterity. So I have given a great chance to go to the place after I'm not more there. I think this experience of exile for all of us is enriching, and it's an extraordinary human, extreme experience. It's pedagogical, it's psychological, it's all what do you want to say? It's enriching compared with the people who are staying there in the little village and don't go beyond that little enclave.
Yes. I have another question.
For whom?
For Professor Manet.
You see?
And
Wisdom.
No, that is the wisdom, not you. Yeah, please.
so
Always is the wisdom is a good question, not the answer. The answers don't matter. Yeah.
So I found in an anthology of Holocaust literature the names of Norman Mania, Primo Levi, Imre Kertész, and many others. And the last section of this book was dedicated to Saffron 4. Everything is illuminated. So my question is, what do you, when you read, if you read novels that were written by people who were not in the Holocaust, they were written by younger people, do you learn something from them, or do you think it's worth for them to write about this event, or do you think it should remain for people who went through the experience?
I think that literature and art and creativity is the biggest form of freedom. Nothing should be blocked. Nothing should be stopped there. So to say that if you are a man you cannot write about a woman, it's not your right to write about. What do you know about women? A man knows a lot about women. Flaubert wrote about Madame Bovary saying, c'est moi, it's me there, and it was him. When you describe a cat, you are there, in the cat. So, speaking about what you ask, I didn't read the book by this young writer. I think, in principle, you cannot stop anything. And the last survivors will soon disappear. And you cannot say that nobody is allowed more to write a story about Holocaust because you didn't go to this experience. The story about the Holocaust is fiction. If you say that you want to write a reportage, a document about Auschwitz, you are not allowed to do it if you were not there. But if you want to write a novel, a story, it's your right. Who knows what you write there? Who knows what you put there? From your memory, from your imagination, from your feeling, I don't know. But in principle, and I'm speaking in principle, I don't think you can, in art and in literature, of course, block anything. You are, when you sit in front of a page which is white, you are in front of the biggest freedom possible, because it's nothing there. And you add something to the world which was not before. It's good, it's bad, this is another story. But you are right to do it. And then you are obeying a judgment. Comes a professor from Italy and says, look, this story, if I compare it with Primo Levi or with Bassani or whatever, it's nothing. Or you can say it's interesting. It's extraordinary that this young man who never went to this experience could see this horror in his own sensitivity and in his own very small experience as a human being. This is my opinion. It's a personal opinion. It's not approved by President Obama.
Let's take a couple more questions because we'll have to finish soon. We'll have to get Professor and Mrs. Manya to South Beach by 7 o'clock. So let's see a student
So we
question.
still have 2 hours. No problem.
And you'll catch a lift with Obama on his helicopter. Okay.
Hi, my name is Derek, and I would just like to point to you that was beautifully put that exiles, they remembered and immigrants dream. Thank you. And but my confusion, like I understand the general meaning of exile, but my confusion is like I try to simplify things to the core to really understand it. Because from a biblical perspective, we all are exiles ever since Eve ate the apple, right? Now, from a scientific, I'm sorry, from a scientific approach, before the continental
You don't
drift,
have to be sorry. I also studied engineering, so I know.
but like before the continental drift, we were all together, right? And then when the continental drift happened, we all spread out. So my confusion is that, is it land or the people you mix? Because people are the ones that create the culture, right? So I'm saying like, for instance, like back to the Bible, I think it was Jacob had 12 sons, like the 12 tribes, right? So they carried that culture. And when they left Egypt, it wasn't like they considered that home for like what temporary. And then when they left, are they considered exiled from Egypt? Or is it like, because the whole people, the culture, the people carry the culture to another land and they create it. So it's like, is what you think of home or what you create of home is not the land, isn't it the people?
I think that a motherland, I like that better than fatherland. La
Very
patria,
feminist word.
la matria, more than la patria, is a construction of many things. And it includes your surroundings. And believe me, I don't think I could recreate Cuban Siberia, you know, with snow as to a tropical country. And it's sounds of music, it smells. You have here Little Havana. We're only 90 miles away. Little Havana has nothing to do with Havana. And you might have the same flavors and you might have the same music, but the city is so different that I think even though it seems like old-fashioned, and maybe I am old-fashioned, to think of your motherland as a physical, geographical place, I think you take it with you the same way a turtle or takes your shell, you take your motherland and your culture with you, but there's also something missing. You're always going to be like afraid of fall, like you're not really firm until you are on your own land. So the answer is like, I don't know. I think you can recreate your culture, but it's like somebody who goes to a museum, recreates an artwork, and it's not like the original, no matter how much you recreate it. And so I don't know if that answers your question. And I'm sure there's more than an answer.
Yes, Oscar.
All right, so it's a general question, but I would like the question to Dr. Gillespie. You said that an exile is this feeling of like nostalgia, or always one like you had to leave your homeland and you felt compelled by economic reasons, political reasons, or whatever reasons to leave and come to, let's say, to the United States. But then you're always like longing for home, right? To go back to home, something like that. So my question is the other way, and then you were distinguishing between immigrant and exile, right? So what if, this is the question, what do you call somebody or something that is compelled to leave, right? But doesn't want to go back to that country, and yet that person is not wanted in the country here. You understand? Like I'm specifically talking about illegal immigrants, basically. So how do you call that, and how could you approach that through the study of exile?
That's I think a tremendously insightful question, because you really touch on the complexity of the individual condition. For me, exile is a state of mind. As Ubu was saying, she is a Cuban writer. She is in exile. She is who she defines herself, as we all are. We are what we define ourselves as. But we come out of a context. And the exilic writer has that context, although there's this traumatic severance, that's always part of his or her nature. When I try to describe it in class, I talk about my own background as growing up on the west side of Chicago in a large Irish family, Irish-American family, in a Catholic neighborhood. If I never went to Mass again, if I never spoke to my family again, if I never went back to Chicago, and by God I won't, except between May and September, I could never stop having been. I couldn't strip that from part of my nature. And that's what the exile is doing, is carrying that identity, that portion of his or her identity, but a portion that has been scarred, has been deformed. There's been this traumatic separation. And the illegal immigrant, that's a political term, that's a legal term, that is a designation imposed on an individual, I think has a multi-layered burden. So I'm trying to avoid giving a specific, precise answer, because I think it's too important, and it would be disrespectful in my perspective to try to label what an illegal immigrant in America is going through. But one of the things that I think is at the center of it is the struggle for identity. Who the hell am I?
Actually, Elie Wiesel lashed out at the very definition of illegal immigrant, at the word illegal. When you talk about human beings, and you talk about them being illegal, almost illegitimate or something like that, you really do harm to the whole human nature, to humanity itself. So one has to be careful with these terms, and no one's illegal. All right, yes, last question.
Hi, my name is Marlene, and I'd like to direct my question to Ms. De Aragon. You mentioned that you live with the feeling of exile every day. Would you say that writing about your experience, creating characters that have gone through exile, helped you, enable you to cope with it?
Oh, certainly. And of course, I have to be honest, it's like when you lose somebody you love, when your pain is very intense, and the pain is not as intense with the passing of time. I mean, I don't, the feeling remains with you, but it doesn't, and the memories remain with you, but that sharpness of the pain that you feel when you lost a parent or a sibling, somebody you really love, is not the same 50 years later. The pain is part of yourself, but it's not, as sharp. But certainly I write. I think it's funny when some people, when I was younger, would say, "Don't stop writing." It's like telling me, don't stop breathing. Because I have to. Even if they weren't readers, I would write. But certainly, I think I've saved a lot of money, psychiatrist or anything like that, doing my writing. My typewriter before, my computer now, they're my psychiatrists. All the trauma goes there in different forms, whether it's a novel or a story or an essay or a poem. Yes, of course it helps you cope.
I want to change my mind for a second, because I saw George's arm up before Ms. Towers, but he was such a gentleman, he yielded to her. So
I just wanted to ask, with the growing sense of, I guess, cosmopolitanism or globalization, or however you want to look at it, what do you think the future holds for exilic writing or exile studies?
I think more and more people will understand it. I think as more people are international, like, think of the name of this school, Florida International University. I don't think there's any person who attends this university who wouldn't be able to understand a text about exile, even if they've never been physically kicked out of somewhere, or they've always had, you know, the best of everything in life. They would know, because just being around those experiences, I think, opens you up so much. And I hope that that's really what's coming for a lot more people, and that we don't, as Professor Menia was saying yesterday, that we don't become tribal again to an extreme, that this idea that we're becoming more international doesn't force us to be so protective of our little insulated selves that we have to start, you know, isolating ourselves back.
Well, exile literature, in fact, helps you to inhabit the world of the other. And with this mass movements and demographic shifts and globalization, for good or for bad, we will nevertheless have to inhabit that world of the other. And a book becomes, or a text becomes that tool that can provide you with another pair of glasses through which you see the world. Well, my friends, this has been a very rich experience. I want to thank Dr. Gillespie, Dr. Aragon, Professor Mania, and Stanley for the wonderful contribution you have made. I know that we could have gone on and on and on because the questions are beautifully interesting and the answers are so provocative. But we will decide we have to stop now. Thank you so much for coming.